One thing that's true of probably everybody who's working as an individual contributor is that you want to be seen as competent and respected by your team. Of course, you always want to get better at your craft, but there's also other reasons, such as getting that promotion that you want. Now, one way of doing that is getting better at programming, whatever that might mean, solving more difficult problems, taking on more responsibility, leading projects end to end, getting better at the product side of things. But all of these things take time. They're probably measured in months or even years, but there's one thing you can do that takes no time at all and that you have the skills for right now. I don't like wasting your time, so everything I'm going to talk about in this video is already visible in the text document on the left. But if you feel like you can improve here, then let's get into it. Now, the background for this is that code review is very difficult. Our code bases are big, they're always getting bigger, nobody really knows all of the code base or how everything works, or can even necessarily fully understand how complicated changes are going to change a system. So what becomes super important is to basically make life easier for your reviewer. And there's a couple of things you can do here. Now, I'm going to give examples of my own PRs, not necessarily because I'm the best in the world at this, but just because it was easy for me to find them and to have examples. So let's think about this from the perspective of the reviewer, right? You open a PR, it has maybe a couple hundred lines worth of changes, and your job is to figure out whether this code makes sense and whether it solves a problem and all of that. But probably you're not that familiar with that area of the code base, so what you kind of end up doing is just a sanity check and commenting on anything that really doesn't make any sense at all. But you might not be all that confident in the changes that you're reviewing actually doing what they're meant to do. One thing you can do there as a reviewer is doing a manual test, but that takes a lot of time and can be quite frustrating as well. So if we now flip the roles, how can you make things easier for the person that's reviewing your code? I think the first thing that's always super important is to kind of give a history and context of why this is even being opened. And so in the case of this PR, I have a description here. And maybe if you're watching this video now, you don't know what Axiom is, you don't know what any of this means, but the goal is that anybody who kind of has passing familiarity with the application and the code base can understand it. So what I like to do is kind of explain what we were doing before and why this was a problem, and then why it was decided to make the change that was made. The next thing that's great to do is give specific context of people talking about this problem or people hitting this problem. So if you have a Slack where your engineers are using the app and commenting on it, or you have Discord or Plane or something like that where users are giving feedback, then these are great things to link. In this case, I've given a link of our CTO hitting this issue. The next thing I really like doing is outlining the changes that are made in the PR kind of in plain English. So of course, the diff should represent the changes that are made in this PR, but it's much easier for the reviewer to read the diff if they're given the context up front. So in this case, we're ensuring that we're always using the correct datasets info, we're showing the find trace button less often, and we're adding a select to look for the trace in a different dataset if no spans were found. The next thing I like doing is giving visual examples. So in this case, I've added a Loom, which is an app where you can easily share screen recordings. Of course, you could also just do a normal screen recording and upload it to GitHub or use anything else. And I've also given a screenshot that shows the visual changes to the UI. Another thing I like to do is to give some other options that were considered or that might be better in the future. So in this case, I've said we could also give the option to search for all datasets because currently this dropdown only lets you pick one dataset. Here's another one. This is quite a small PR, so it doesn't have all of these things, but I've still explained the background and what the solution does, and I've also given a video. So let's take a look at that video.
Hey, quick demo on what this PR does. So when a user tries to open a trace and some of the params are missing, so for example, the start and end time, then we do our best to find a trace anyway and display it. So for example, I have this trace open, I'm on dev here, I can remove the time param, and the trace will still open because we kind of look back in time and do our best to find it. But the problem is if I now save this link or send it to somebody and then I try to open it again like a day from now or a week from now, then this fallback of trying to find the trace might not work anymore because we only look back a certain amount of time. So what I've done here is, let me remove this as well, that if a part of it is missing and we get it back when finding the trace, then we update the URL to make a URL that can be shared permanently. So if I search here, you'll see we now have a trace end parameter and a trace start parameter, and that means that the link to this trace will work permanently. So yeah.
And the goal with a video like this is just to kind of give quick context and let the reviewer see visually what the background is and what the changes do and why they were made. The next thing that I find quite important in some situations is to add tests. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy about how many tests you should write, where you should write them, all of that. But one heuristic I kind of have, especially in front-end code, where maybe you don't want to test every React component to hell and back because it's just going to slow you down, is to ask, does this feel like library code? And if yes, add some tests so that the next person working in it doesn't cause a regression. And the nice side effect of adding these regression tests is that it also explains to somebody reading these functions that might be kind of complicated what it actually does. So in this example here, I have a function that does something particular with two arrays and one value. This isn't the worst, most complicated function of all time, but it's still pretty easy to write a mistake here. And maybe even more critically, it's quite hard for a reviewer to be certain that this works as expected. So what I've done here is written a bunch of tests that have, example large arrays, small arrays, and values, and then say how the function should perform in this case. And like I said, there's kind of two benefits to this. The first is that you're confident now that it works as it does. The second is that a person working on it in the future, maybe adding another case or some specific handling of some edge case, isn't going to break the core functionality of the function. And the last one that's the most relevant to this video is that this gives the reviewer the ability to kind of be confident that the function works as expected for the cases that you've given here. Here's another example. We have this old code that was using kind of messy regex parsing and other stuff, accessing index 2 of this thing to find a data set in APL. And it doesn't really matter for the sake of this video what that actually means, but we've replaced it here with another call to a different function. And that function kind of does AST parsing and, it's also quite complicated. So how do I know as a reviewer that the new thing is as good as or better than this thing? And the answer is that from reading the code, that's probably quite hard to do. But if there are tests that give specific cases and tell you what the function does in these cases, then you can feel a lot more comfortable as a reviewer or a lot more confident to know that this function behaves as it should. The next thing that's super important to me is to read your own diff before you open the PR, or open it as a draft first and then read the diff. The first reason is that actually when reading the diffs, I very often find things that could still be improved, or like comments to myself that I've left in there that maybe shouldn't be in the final thing. The second reason is that it can also be used as an opportunity to, again, make things easier for the reviewer. So one thing that I like to do, especially in cases where I'm not quite sure about my own solution, is to kind of point that out and make it easier for the reviewer to know what I don't feel confident about. Of course, they should also look at the PR from their own point of view, but I find that asking questions or showing, hey, I don't know if this is the best solution, can really help with fostering a culture of good reviews. So in this case, I've made an implementation detail of a store public. I don't love this. I said that here, but at least I called it out to the reviewer and they've kind of implicitly agreed with me that it's fine to do this. The final point I want to make is that there's really never an excuse to not do these things, or at least not do some of these things. So even in very small PRs, that it's only one small change. So in this case, I added an extra case to a string parsing function here. And you might say, it's very obvious what this code does, but it might not be that obvious what it does in the application. So in this case, I've not given that much background. I've just said, before this looked like this, we had this list of values and the empty string just shows as like an empty cell in the table. And after it shows as the string empty string. So even for small PRs, you should definitely always give some context. And the second thing here is that you should also do it, and maybe especially do it for hotfixes that you make during incidents. So maybe production is broken and you figured out why and you write a fix and you open the PR, and your goal is kind of to get this out as fast as possible because you want to restore service. But the truth is, writing 2 or 3 sentences on what the problem was and how you solved it shouldn't take more than a couple of seconds. So even in those cases, I think it's really important to do that. The last point I want to make is that really all of this should end up in Git history. In the repo settings in GitHub, you have the option to decide what should happen when pull requests are merged. And in our case, we have squash merging on. And the important thing here is that the title and the description goes in. And if you use merge commits, then I also think that at least in the merge commit itself, you should always have the title and the description. And the reason for this is just like I've said, that you always want to have the context there in the future, because somebody else might look at this 3 months from now or 3 years from now, or maybe it's yourself 3 years from now, and you want to understand why changes were made, because otherwise it can be very easy to revert or to change something in a way where you reproduce the old problem that you had fixed in the past. So that's all I had to talk about today. I think it's super important to make life easier for your team and to always give them the context they need. And like I said before, if you've written the code, then you already have all of the knowledge to do this. So I think there's really no excuse not to do it. And if you haven't done it before and start doing it, I think you'll really find it improves how you interact with your team. And if there isn't really a culture of doing this on your team, then just by starting to do this yourself, you might find that it becomes kind of infectious and other people also start doing it. And it really helps a lot with productivity. So yeah, I hope this was helpful and thanks for watching.